how honored I am to be sharing the stage with Justice Page, and how honored I am to have been invited to come to this event and celebrate the 50th anniversary with all of you. It's extraordinarily flattering. And I'm also delighted to be back in the Twin Cities. As I'm a Canadian, as David told you, and so every time I hear that accent, I feel right at home. We're all here to talk about the future of the Twin Cities, about the decisions that everyone in this room and everyone in this community is going to have to make in the coming years if this community is going to continue to thrive. But before I get to that very critical question, I want to go back into the past a little bit and tell a story of something that happened in this country about 70 years ago. In the 1920s and the 1930s, about 1 million men and women crossed the border from Mexico into California and Texas. This was the first of the great Mexican migrations into the United States, and they came to work as migrant workers in the Central Valley and to work on the railroads in the South and in Texas. And in many ways, they were typical immigrants of that era. They were fleeing repression and upheaval in their native country. They didn't have a lot of money. They were largely illiterate. They worked very hard. They wanted to put down roots here. They sent their children to schools. They went to church every Sunday. But the 1920s and the 1930s were a very bad time to be an immigrant in California. Congress had just passed two of the most restrictive immigration laws in this country's history in 1917 and 1924. Popular sentiment against outsiders had never been higher, even in comparison to that kind of sentiment that we see today. The growers who hired those migrant workers, as a result, pretended they weren't really immigrants. And they called them birds of passage, because they liked to pretend that they would just come north for the harvest and then go home again. And the communities where those people lived also pretended that they weren't really immigrants. They weren't really people who were living here. They were just people passing through. And so they treated them as if they weren't there. And so the migrant workers couldn't really put down roots. They were afraid to buy property. They were scared to make any kinds of ties in their community because they knew they may have to move on. And then in the 1930s, the Depression hit. And what happened in the Depression? Well, the U.S. Secretary of Labor got up and said, the reason this country is in depression is that Americans don't have enough jobs. And the reason they don't have enough jobs is that foreigners have taken those jobs. And so the solution to the Depression is to send the foreigners home. And so a very shameful thing happened in the state of California, something which incredibly has been largely forgotten over the years. And that is in the first 3 and 4 years of the 1930s, 500,000 Mexicans and Mexican Americans, most of whom were here legally, were rounded up in Southern California, pushed into the back of trucks, and shipped back over the border to Mexico. And when you look at the fact that Hispanics in this country have only recently begun to climb the economic ladder, that's a big part of the reason why. Because the first wave of Mexican immigrants in this country got sent home before they were allowed to lay a proper foundation in this country. Now, it's worth comparing the Mexican immigrants' experience, I think, to what happened to an earlier generation of immigrants. Right around the turn of the century, in 1900, millions of Jewish and Italian immigrants came to New York City from Europe. And they were, in many ways, typical immigrants. They were fleeing repression and upheaval in their native country. They didn't have a lot of money. They were largely illiterate. They worked very hard. They sent their children to schools. They tried to put down roots. They went to synagogues on Saturday and church on Sunday. But there was one big difference between that group of immigrants and the Mexicans who came in the 30s. And that is that the community that they entered welcomed them. When those immigrants from Italy and Eastern Europe sailed into New York Harbor, they saw the Statue of Liberty, right? And below the statue, was it below or on top? I forget. It said, You know, those famous words of Emma Lazarus, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free. And their arrival in New York City coincided with a great wave of social reform in that community. Right? That was the period when the hospitals were finally built and the social services were set up and building codes were passed. And this was the dawn of the trade union movement, which allowed those people to move into jobs where they had some degree of security. Right? By the end of the First World War, New York City set out to build a public school system that was the envy of the world. So the children of those immigrants got access to a great public school education, something that no generation of immigrants in American history had ever had. And when those children grew up, they went to City College in New York City, where they were able to get a college education that was the equal of any college education they could find in the United States for free. Right? And when we look at how the descendants of that group of immigrants have risen up the economic ladder, this is a big part of the reason why. Because when their grandfathers and great-grandfathers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers came to New York City, they were welcomed and they were allowed to lay a proper foundation in this country. I think there's a really important lesson in that story, because so often when we tell the story of communities or ethnic groups, right, we sometimes think that their success or failure hinges entirely on the things that they do for themselves. That their success or failure is entirely predicated on their own actions and values and behaviors, right? We say the Italians worked very hard, the Jews valued education. We pretend that success and achievement are entirely a function of what groups do for themselves. But that's an illusion, right? When we look closely at history, we see that success is also a function of how those groups are treated by others. What the immigrant stories of America tell us is how big a role the rest of society plays in determining success, achievement in this country. Right? We turned our backs as a country on Mexicans in 1930, and we set them back a generation. And we welcomed the Jews and the Italians at the turn of the century, and they helped us build a stronger country. Well, I tell you all of that because I think the Twin Cities today is at that same point that New York was at in 1900 and California was at in 1930. Right? You have in your midst a very vulnerable community. And if you read the Council on Crime and Justice's report, you will learn all kinds of very important facts about that vulnerable community. But over the next 25 years, that community is going to grow much faster than the white population of this area. Right? Today, the 7-county population of minorities is about 17%. In 25 years, it'll be 30%. In the same period, the white community in this area is going to grow much older, but the minority population will not. Right? The percentage of adult males between 18 and 30, which in terms of the criminal justice system is the critical age cohort, that group is going to double in size over the next 25 years. And the prognosis for those groups, if present trends continue, is not encouraging. Right? If you look at the projected rate of African American arrests in this community over the next 25 years, it's going to go from 45,000 to 93,000 a year. Right? If you look at the projected adult imprison rate in this community, if you look at the chart, the curve is like that. It's like a ski slope. Right? When I was talking to the people from the council, to Tom Johnson from the council about this report, the comment he made that sticks out in my mind is that if you look at the critical indices like dropout rates and teenage pregnancies and arrest records in the minority community in this city, the trend lines here look like the trend lines for the minority community of Detroit. That's not a comparison that would immediately have come to mind when you think